nice, small group, intimate grandmoms talking. I didn't realize how many people I didn't see around my screen. Once I found out, of course, shell shock set in. And, well, you know what happens when speakers get nervous. But anyway, um, in talking about stories, most of you know mine, mostly because of this particular missive. And I try to tell people I did not set out to write a book. What you are actually reading is about half of my journal. For good or ill, as a quick squirrel, and you're going to get a lot of those tonight, a couple of my crazy next generation of my leather family is in the process of editing the entire blasted thing, adding pictures, God help me, and in some rather twisted ways, turning this book into an audio. They've been asking people if they're willing to read their favorite passage. And for me, that's going to be kind of fun because I will hear my words from somebody else's mouth and with their expressions and attitudes. But in 1994, when Philip Miller and Molly Devon asked if they could publish my journal, when I stopped laughing at them and reminding them that they would lose their shirt, I also said that I wrote the damn thing and I wouldn't read it, mostly because I think journals and diaries are boring. The incidents that you read about tend to be unique to the person who wrote them. And the backstory that creates the entry isn't seen or heard because it's either a journal or a diary. The story that goes with the story that is written is all running around in the writer's head. When I went back through this and realized that my mind filled in the blanks, it became a little problematic for me because none of the people who read this would be able to know what was going on in my brain. So after Utah, I got a lot of questions about the journal and could I fill in some of the blanks about certain passages. A lot of them erotic, a lot of them historic, far more of them erotic than historic, but hey. And was asked whether or not I would do something to create a library channel to tell one or two of the passages and then tell the stories behind them. So you all are going to be my test subjects for 3 different journal entries, and you're going to get to hear what was happening around them. So, making sure that I can see my own bad handwriting. The first entry. Dear Jill, thank you very much for the loan of your slave Vi. I did indeed exercise most of the options and suggestions offered. I believe we know each other better now. Through my many questions, I feel I know you a little better too. I found Vi, so far, to be a model slave and I had no cause to evoke punishment. I'm sure that will change eventually. 12/12/1980, Friday. My first report card. Nobody would believe this night I still have butterflies in my stomach. I just spent the last 8 hours with Mistress Catherine Sharp. Why? I don't know. Jill casually mentioned at 7 p.m. that I better get a move on because I had an 8 p.m. appointment with Catherine Sharp. Talk about frightening? We spent most of the night talking about everything, talking about me, Jill, politics, people, the scene, everything. I find her fascinating and a great conversationalist, but the lack of rhyme or reason for the meeting frightens me. I gave the lady a massage that she seemed to enjoy, and then I went home. For those of you who have read this, there needs to be some background information, and for those of you who have just heard it, here's the story. Jill and I, as most of you know, 40 almost 46 years ago, fell in love and started doing a whole lot of kinky things and ultimately settled down to what outsiders might consider a very traditional husband and wife role. But the more we fell into the married routine, the less we played. Until finally we sat down to talk one day and she said what felt like play to her play partner now felt like abuse to her wife. Interesting statement. Well, I'd gotten home from work and we did all the things that Jill and I do to wind down our day. Had dinner, I tended to greet her at the door with a drink. We laughed for a while, talked for a while, and then this, "Hi, you have an appointment in an hour," came out of the blue. Took a quick shower, changed clothes. She quite literally tied a red ribbon around my neck. Now this is pre-AIDS, so the red ribbon had no meaning. Looked like a big Christmas bow. Put a note in my teeth where I was told to leave it. Gave me an address, told me at 8 o'clock I was to ring the doorbell and stand there. I did. To love, to obey, to serve. At 8 o'clock, as I was counting down on my watch, I rang the doorbell. A woman opened the door, took the note out of my teeth, and read it. She looked up at me and asked whether or not I knew what was in the note, and I said no. She invited me to come in, and the rest of it is as you saw it, or heard it, I should say. She gave me a tour of her house, and we sat and spent the evening talking about everything. When I got home, Jill was already in bed and sound asleep, and I was up all night trying to figure out what just happened. And by the next day, I was trying to figure out not just what just happened, but why it happened. Now, this kind of encounter went on for 3 or 4 more times as Jill, Catherine, and I got to know each other. Jill's way of solving the problem of wifely love and abuse versus playmate love and fun was to find someone she trusted and then make me a gift, which is ultimately what happened. I became a gift to Catherine. Ultimately, the 3 of us ended up buying a house together. Some of that, if any of you are old enough to remember Contact Magazine's Corporal Publishing Empire, Janet Griner's publishing empire, and an awful lot of kinky SM movies. The house that we built together became the foundation for a lot of those movies, a lot of the pictures that were taken for those magazines of the early 80s, and an awful lot of really awesome kinky parties. But that is the backstory to that entry and how this thing starts. Now, that was owner number 1, taking Jill out of the equation entirely because Jill is, was, and always will be. Entry number 2, this is February 3rd, 1983. Madam, it's a sweet smell, the owner of burning flesh. The aroma is not entirely unpleasant. The skin makes a sizzling sound as the iron connects, not unlike frying bacon or an egg, just as it drops onto a hot griddle. I watched your every move today. The fact that you forced me to was one reason. The fact that I was fascinated, another. I was by your side when you brought out the white cotton towel. It has to be cotton, you told me. I was just inches away from the stove when you lit it, placed the insignia that would forever mark me yours in the center of the blue glass frame. You picked up the brand by its handle, checked the color, and pressed it into the towel for the count of 2. I remember the smell as the glowing iron quickly burned through the layers of cloth. In just a few hours, my skin would replace the towel. Your first attempt did not please you. I watched in silence as you heated the iron again and again, practicing until the results were satisfying. You handed me the practice towel sprayed heavily with your perfume. Then you locked me away to meditate for the rest of the afternoon on the commitment I was about to make. The bonding was not the only thing in my mind. My decision to serve you was made long ago. Tonight we just make formal the unspoken vow. The searing in my thigh is not as loud as the pounding in my heart. Now my heart belongs to you. In 83, the concept of a slave being branded was not just a radical step, it was a step that wasn't taken that often. But this is also going back almost 30 years. And the piercers and body modification specialists that we have now weren't really around then. But Nan wanted to have me branded. Whoops, slip of the tongue. Jean wanted to have me branded. And so, finding someone who actually knew how to do this was a bit of a puzzle. Well, there weren't a lot of people in the tribe who had a clue how to actually brand someone. But for those of you who are familiar with Black Greeks, the fraternity Omega Psi Phi brands all of their pledges, and they have for decades. So I called a cousin of mine who was a Q, as they're known, an Omega, and he gave my mistress branding lessons. That was an interesting position to be in, if you can imagine that I have a family member teaching my mistress how to apply a hot brand to my body. But the way the Qs do it is to practice on a white cotton towel because of the way it burns. And it burns very similar to the amount of heat needed on human skin. So after the brand had been made, which by the way was a high heel, I watched her practice and practice and practice. I was fascinated, horrified, and scared to death all at the same time. There were 1,000 questions that were running through my mind. Was it going to hurt? What would it look like? Would it heal properly? Black skin has a tendency to keloid. Would I keloid? Would I not? Would I embarrass myself with a sound that was unbecoming a slave? And so on. A special little apartment had been rented for the party, and there were about 10 people there to watch this branding happen. The ritual repeated itself over again. And that hot iron was applied to my right thigh. For those of you who have ever read any of the Gore series, a Kajira is branded on her right thigh, and that's where the mark was. It happened so fast, to be quite honest, I didn't have time to scream. Let me back up. The pain is less remembered than the smell. Now, if you have ever watched a branding and that scent comes wafting by your nose, that's one thing. When you know that the scent that's reaching your nose is your skin, that's a very different memory. And far more than the pain, it is the scent that I remember. And believe it or not, it's not all that unpleasant. That's entry 2. Entry 3 and owner 3, many of you probably know. When this book was published, we weren't talking to each other. Hence, I had to use a fictitious name, as are most of the names here. Unless I could get permission to use the names had to be changed, and they changed over 300 of them. And I had to remember them all, which really got to be a challenge. Did I mention I'm old and, rapidly going senile? But that's a whole different story. But since we have long since talked together, laughed together, loved together, and told stories about this book together, and she is the person who said, yes, Wren Jackson and Mistress Muir are the same person, I can now tell you that the person that I am about to read, the entry I'm about to read, is about Mistress Muir. It was one of our first real encounters. It was only about 3 weeks after my mom and my uncle died. My mother and my great uncle actually died within an hour of each other the same night. So to say that my head was on backwards would be an understatement. The person who straightened it out and took me out of my grief was Muir. And this was the first time that we had actually played together, and then I had stayed over that night. Well, for those bottoms who are familiar with bottom drop, anything after the euphoria can sometimes be described as mild shock, including the chills, the slight disorientation, the stupid smile, the adrenaline rush, and so on. Muir sort of guided me to her guest room, which had a California king. The bed was easily big enough to sleep 4 comfortably. The thing was ginormous. Tucked me into bed, and I was still cold. So she brought out something very special for me to sleep under, right after she chained me to the bed. 1:23, Saturday. My senses tell me that I'm dreaming. My mind knows I'm awake. What I'm experiencing now only happens in my fantasies. The warm rounded steel restraining wrist and ankle is deliciously real. In the blackness of this room, in the huge expanse of this bed, I can sense you. Mixed with the aroma of night is the sweet scent of perfume and pheromone. The intoxicating mix makes me question my sanity. No, it's just my senses I'm unsure of. Against the nakedness, the fur of your coat protects me from the room's cool air. It tickles my nose and sends the essence of you straight to my brain. If you could permeate the fibers of this coat any more, you and the fur would be one. The fiber of this coat was long ago sacrificed to keep you beautiful, and now to keep me warm. How do you expect me to sleep like this? The hiatus that bind me in this fetal position seem to have encased my mind as well. The blackness of this room is almost womb-like. All my senses are in your control, and it sets my mind reeling. Oh, calm down. Your clit's throbbing faster than your heart is beating, or your head is running. I pray that there is an eternity till morning. I pray that you can't find the keys to these cuffs. I pray that I stay wrapped in your fur until hell freezes over. I can't get the images of you out of my head. Oh, just shut your eyes and go to sleep, you fool. I see images of you where I know they don't exist. I can feel your hands attaching my collar. Oh, will you stop? Wren is sleeping 2 rooms over. You have unknowingly programmed me to exotic and erotic thoughts of you. Sweet dreams are made of this. I still think of a couple of those scenes and blush, and yes, I can. But Wren, which is what she's called in the book, Muir tucked me in under her fox fur coat. At the end of the weekend, she sent me home with the fur and told me I was to sleep under it for 30 days. I did. 30 days later, I sent it back to her. And a week after that, it came back as a blanket. she had had the fox turned into a blanket so that I could always sleep under the center fan until it finally fell apart. I did. But the Hyatt cuffs that put me in that insane position weigh about 6.5 pounds a set, which is a nice way of saying you do not roll over suddenly, because clunking yourself in the head once is an incredibly painful lesson. And occasionally when she has ordered me to, although we haven't actually been mistress and slave for over 20 years, I will still put them on. So, does any of this shock, surprise, or create a giggle? Toni, what do you think?
I think this is phenomenal. I remember reading this the very first time, and the second time, and the third time. Let's open it up for questions for folks. That was beautiful, Vi. Thank you. I'm looking at all the comments, and people are loving that they're hearing this in your voice, with your story, and giving the context and the background to the words that they've read, some of us many times. Any questions? I mean, I could open it up, but there's 90 of us, and that could be chaos. It's easier if you write in the chat a question, and I'll read it off to Mama Vi. Somebody says, it makes me miss the dynamics of the slash, Vi. Others are just loving this story. How did the fox blanket get destroyed, Vi?
Skin, as I ultimately had to learn, hide, has to be taken care of very, very differently, which is why women actually don't wear furs year-round, not just because of the heat, but because ultimately they begin to degenerate. And she had the coat spread open, lined, and then sent back with her. They made actually a lining of the coat and added to it. But I slept under it 365 days a year for years. Eventually, thread just wore out. And the hide, ultimately, even though it absorbed the oils from my body, also finally just gave out. And it got a little more tattered than I could continue to use as a blanket.
Great. Somebody else asked, Vi, tell us the reaction of your Q family member. Did he follow up to find out how the branding went?
Yes. As a matter of fact, he asked me to take a Polaroid, for those of you who remember what a Polaroid is, of the brand and of my thigh, actually, and the brand, and send them both to him. There were bragging rights for the longest time.
Someone else writes, do you still have the wolf, right?
Yes. My wolf, I sleep, actually, for those of you who, well, most of you wouldn't, for those of you who have ever been in my home, know that I sleep under two dream spirit animals. I sleep under the hide of a buffalo and the hide of a wolf. And I learned to keep them above the covers, not against my skin.
Is journaling still something that you do, Vi?
Ooh, kinda. I journaled far more regularly up until about 10 years ago. And unfortunately, in some ways, Facebook began to replace that. It doesn't have the depth of the ability to journal like LiveJournal, for those of us back in the day who remembered communicating through LiveJournal. It doesn't have the depth of those entries, but it allowed the entries to be more frequent. I I have bits and pieces of some of the early entries, and I was thinking of going back and looking at both my notes and recordings that I've done for myself to expand on them.
Maya says the passage was the one that helped her realize that I wasn't alone in needing that type of devotion. What meaning does the brand hold for you now that your relationship has ended?
Squirrel. When the relationship that put that brand on my thigh ended, much to my surprise, a little less than 2 months later, my body began to change. Within about 6 months, the mark had entirely disappeared. I know where it is, and I can't find it. And this mark was on my thigh, my right thigh, for 10 years. It didn't, 9 years. It didn't tan. It didn't keloid, which kind of surprised me. It looked like someone had literally almost taken dry ice and lifted all the color out of my skin. I could be out in the sun for days. It never got darker, it got red, but it never changed color. Within 6 months of the breakup, the brand disappeared. Now, as a lead into to Mistress Mir, because Mir knew the story of the brand. And when she marked me, she said, "This one isn't going away." And she had me tattooed.
So this is a kind of a statement question, Vi. So you were a furry before it was cool?
Actually, yes. More years ago than some of you were probably around, the early generations of the NLA had different chapters. One was in Los Angeles. NLA LA was made famous by an art show that it did for one night only, that had everything from sketches and sculpture to performance art. It was controversial as hell because two of the pieces we were showing were actually Mapplethorpe's. My Jean brought her cage. She was going to do a scene on top of it as a performance piece. I had been up for 2 days straight setting up that show and was told to take a 15-minute break in the cage, which is where I slept half the time anyway. Climbed into the cage and was at rest until a young man whose beast persona looked at me in the cage, and I could tell by looking in his eyes, he was part envious and part jealous. We began to make contact on a level that I had always repressed. Within about 10 minutes, whatever humanity I had was gone. And we were interacting wolf to wolf. To say that it stopped the art show would be an understatement. 200 and some odd people evidently stopped what they were looking at to watch us. The man who owned that boy was a man named Robert Kirk, who also drew at the time under the name Kirby. He did some sketches of his boy and I, one on the outside and one on the inside. I don't know if they were ever published, but from that point on, the beast in me reared its adorable or ugly little head whenever it wanted to. And a gift from his boy was his wolf tail.
Vi, question. What were you most nervous about putting out there in the first version of your book, putting it all out there?
All of it? When When Philip Miller and Molly Devon, who owned Mystic Rose Press and were the authors for Screw the Roses, Send Me the Thorns, first talked to me about printing my journal, they knew they pretty much had me by the short hairs when they told me I owed it to history. Because at the time I was serving on the board of the Leather Archives Museum. So they pretty much knew they had me. It never dawned on me that anybody would read it. As I said, I wouldn't. So I wasn't really thinking about it. I mean, we went through all the gyrations. I still have my contract somewhere. I'm probably the only writer in history that has a spanking clause in my contract if I miss the date. With all the work we did, it wasn't real. It came out at Self. The books arrived 3 weeks before Southeast Leather Fest 96. As a matter of fact, the big Master Slave Conference. And it's still, Molly called and said she had rented a suite to premiere the book. Yeah, that's nice. That Tuesday, because we were due to leave, Jill and I were driving down on Thursday. That Tuesday, a box showed up at the door. Doorbell rang, postman delivers this thing, one of the boys brings it upstairs, drops it on the floor at my desk, and it damn near broke the floor. The box was that heavy. And I'm trying to figure out what the heck I could have ordered that would weigh this much. Okay, so I grabbed the scissors, opened the box, pulled open the paper. And as I picked the first book up, everything got real painfully quickly. Because until then, this was just some elaborate daydream. I picked up the first book and I said out loud, "Oh my God, what have I done?" I started shaking and shook all the way through the drive down, the getting ready to do the first reading. As a matter of fact, I was shaking so badly, I couldn't see the pages to read. Queen Cougar put her hand on my lap and said, "Calm down, these people are your friends." I remembered getting through the reading. The copy that I was reading from, Molly took back. They had an auction, the original book, the copy I was reading from, sold at auction to Master Steve Sampson for $500 for the Jack Stice Memorial Travel Fund. I was in shock. I was in shock for most of the weekend. And then by the time I got back, I settled back into, nobody's going to read this thing, calm down. Those of you who know me well know that I am not a betting woman. I bet only in two instances. One, if I don't care if I lose, or two, when I know I'm going to win. So don't bet against me. If I'd taken a bet on that, I would have lost the farm. It's been read by about 35,000 of my closest friends. And there is stuff in there I wouldn't tell my shrink if I had one. There's stuff in there that still pisses Jill off, and it's been 20 years. 25 in some cases, 30 depending on how far back you go. It has been, and still is, the most humbling experience of my life. Philip and Molly were right, and I was dead wrong. They said that while the incidents were unique to me, the emotions were universal. And I guess they are, because I still get emails from different corners of the world asking me to elaborate on some things, or letters from mostly slaves and submissives going, "How did you know I was going through this? Get out of my head or stop writing my life." which is a very long and roundabout way of saying, what was I nervous about, or what part of it? Absolutely none of it. And then all of it.
Via question, the journals, were they something that you kept on your own, or was it a protocol of a master that asked you to do that?
It was a protocol. Ultimately, my journal became my therapy. But when it started, and this would only make sense for slaves of my era, a slave of my era was not expected to, quote, impose, close quote, their emotions on their owner. If Ed McMahon, for those of you who remember him, rang my doorbell and said, here's $1 million, my tone when I spoke to my owner would be, Madam, I'd like to take you out to dinner. There's something I need to tell you. When my mother became ill, or actually, let me back up. When 2 of my classmates died, and they died pretty much the same week, I had to say to Jean, please excuse me, madam, I've had a tragedy, and I really need to get away from you right now to be alone. There was no modification in tone either way. It's not that we didn't have emotions. We weren't expected to express those to our owner. So the journal became the place where those emotions went. Kind of my Pandora's box in reverse. It began mechanically because I was ordered to, and I was ordered to keep a journal versus a diary. Because a diary is usually day to day. A journal is when something happens that you want to record. And it was figured if I had the time to keep a diary, I was doing something wrong. So I kept the journal when something happened that I found interesting. But as things evolved, and those who have actually read the original journal say they could begin to tell what phase I was in by the tone, that the writing became less mechanical and far more emotional, and less the observer than the participant. And some of them, I write stream of consciousness, which is why I could never be a really good writer. Because what goes on the pages comes straight out of my mouth. It is the way I think it without correction. Because if I actually stopped to correct it, I probably wouldn't write it. So what you are reading is the way it came out. And what started as an exercise for my owners became probably the most important therapy I could ever have had.
Via, question about the cage. This account that you gave of the cage, was this the first time that you felt primal was in that cage?
Yes and no. Had those feelings sort of crept up before and, suddenly I felt the urge to growl? Sure. Had it ever really taken me over? That was the first time. I only have that's not true. My memories of the last 2 hours of that night are still seen through the eyes of the wolf that's a part of me. I remember scent. I remember people. I remember Bob's playfulness. I remember us swatting at each other and playing it with each other. I remember reaching through the cage to nibble on him and him on me. It was the first time the beast took over.
Vi, tell us about your choice of scene name versus stage name. You go by Mama Vi. Do you have regrets about that, or conversely, are they points of pride that you use your name, Viola?
Back in the day, And please remember, I'm backing up 45 years. This tribe was a whole lot smaller. And it never dawned on us to use what has now become the classic scene name or moniker. Daddy was Jack Jackson. My big brothers were Tom and Jerry McNichol. Pat Bond was the founder of the group I went into. We were who we were. There was no reason to disguise my identity, because the only person whose opinion I cared about knew what I did, and that was my mother. As to the rest of my family, and I come from a biologically very, very big one. You don't like what I'm doing, please don't let the door hit you where the good Lord split you. So it never dawned on me that I had a reason to hide. The name Mama has gotten put in front of Vi. The name Grandmom has been put in front of Vi. And now Gigi, or Great-Grand, has been put in front of Vi. And it's the only title that I've ever needed. So I am who I am. The woman who looks back at me in the mirror is very proud of what she sees, bumps, bruises, scars, and all.
Vi, I'm going to go off script and I'm going to ask my own question here. I would love to hear if you could tell everybody what Hellfire was. And can you tell us a Hellfire story? Because the ones that I've read in Cowboy Jen's collection have been awesome. And I just don't feel like folks get a chance to experience that kind of thing anymore. Can you tell us what Hellfire is and tell us a story?
Oh, the Hellfire Club. New York was an interesting place in the late 70s into the early 80s, but by 82, AIDS had shut down a lot of our clubs. New York had SM nightclubs. If you wanted the ritzy and posh, you went to Club O. It was owned by a lesbian couple, and the carpeting in the playrooms was thick enough for me to literally pick you up and drop you, and all you would do was bounce. Lois, the slave, didn't want slaves' knees, so she designed a play space she would be comfortable in. And it was open Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday, keeping normal bar hours up until about 2. If you wanted something to do on Thursdays, Tuesdays and Thursdays, you went to Chateau 19. Much smaller version, only a few pieces of equipment, but a wonderful atmosphere where you could just sit around and talk and learn. But after the conventional clubs closed, we went wandering off to a little place that you could access from West 9th, that if you didn't know where it was, you would probably miss it. It was an old subway station that had long since been abandoned, shut down. You got through it through, the way you got to a lot of subway stations, down a set of stairs and into an area under a building, classic New York. Hellfire was an old abandoned subway station that had been converted. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being as filthy as your little heart could imagine, this was about a 26. I'm convinced that there were viruses on the walls that probably started the plague. A piss room whose tub got cleaned out, I believe, twice a year. Think about that one. It was grimy. It was filthy. 2 of the back rooms had walls put up so that you could have glory holes. It had more than enough little rooms off of it, and what could be considered now classic dungeon equipment. Yes, the spikes had been driven into the stone wall so that the chains would stay on. There was a small bar when the club first opened that sort of went the way of all flesh because they had trouble with the liquor license, so it was bring your own. One interesting piece in the first room you came into, the front room, that looked like it had originally been set up by a mechanic, the kind of thing you would hoist a motorcycle or a car engine up on, and other pretty much rudimentary play equipment around the various places of Hellfire. The lights were fairly low except in the main room, where they weren't that bright, but they were brighter than everywhere else. And I felt safer chained to a pillar naked at Hellfire than I could ever feel in the police station. The 19th precinct was right down the street. It was home. The play was hot because it was family. We didn't care. We policed ourselves. And believe me when I tell you, while it was edgy and it tiptoed around an awful lot of things, it wasn't truly dangerous because the tops that were there would never have allowed someone to be deliberately hurt. Up until 82, it was pretty much all family because you had to know where you were going to get there. The tourists hadn't found Hellfire yet, and yes, at some point they actually did find us. There was Jill and I left in 84, probably the end of 83, when a tour bus literally pulled up in front of Hellfire because we had suddenly become trendy and the club was on the tour. And about 40 of the polyesters got out, went down the stairs, pays their money, and watched the perverts. The club changed pretty quickly. But until then, it was home. A story that evidently they still told at Hellfire in the middle of I was doing a scene with Jill and Baroness Monique Von Cleef. And subspace took over, and whatever planet that I was floating around on obviously had great gas in the atmosphere because I was gone. I had been attached to this frame, and on one facing me, on the other side of what was about an 8 foot by 8 foot, was a motorcycle, a full Harley, that was about a foot off the floor and was used for scenes. I don't remember much except having a involuntary muscular contraction. And when the contraction stopped, my arms, which should have been up, were down, and the chains that were holding me were on the floor, as was the motorcycle and the entire frame. Such is the power of an orgasm, especially one that's brought on by a really good flogging.
The end?
For now.
Well, we promised to keep this 1 hour. I'm going to put the link down there one more time. And the reason for that is to keep Vi young and spry and not burn out, right? To do a series of leather bedtime stories. And I am thrilled to say today we did a Zoom lesson with Judy and Jay, and I see Jay's on the call. So I think I can announce this now, that on Friday night, the South Central Women a Drummer is going to host Judy Tawing. And we're going to do our best to get all the technology together because this will be a first time for Judy on Zoom. And next Monday night, we'll have another guest speaker. And Vi will be back in 2 weeks. And with Boy Robbie, do a joint leather bedtime story duo, right, from the library. And we thank you from the bottom of our heart for coming on and telling us stories and telling us more about your book, Do you have some parting wisdom for us? I mean, you always have wisdom.
I know Robbie is going to start cringing and run and hide. Because I'm about to embarrass him and throw him under the bus. Most people, when they see Robbie, see him by my side. Yes, he is the wind beneath my wings, and he is the force and the energy that makes the library happen. But very few people know that that boy has a long history in this tribe and has been, I mean, not just a title holder and not just a Miss New Jersey. He holds a Mid-Atlantic Boot Black title. But he was also a Rhode Island enforcer. He was around for Paddleboro and all of those Rhode Island and New England stories. There's 30 plus years of history rolled up in that little package. And he has a tendency not to tell those stories because he either defers to me or ducks behind me whenever he thinks he can get away with it. But the amount of history he has is rich. And so the next time we're here, I'm not just going to put him on the spot, I'm going to make sure he can't back out. And so, for those of you who think Boy Robbie's only identity is with me, with Jill, and with the library, you are very, very wrong. And you're going to hear some of those stories firsthand. Right, boy?
You should see in the chat, Vi, there's like Robbie cheers going. Robbie, 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 Robbie. We love Robbie, right? So it's all good. It's all good. Yay, Robbie, right? Thank you, Vi. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and talking to us and telling us some stories. You'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm not very good at math, but I'm thinking that somewhere around the 28th or 27th or something like that. On a Monday night during this time. This is the Woman a Drummer hosted Monday night from the North Central region, and Robbie is one of the co-coordinators. Beth Jacobs is the other co-coordinator, and she has been, Vi, I don't know if you know this, she's been interpreting for the deaf and hearing impaired as we've been going through your stories tonight.
Beth, thank you. Thank you so much.
So we have Beth and Robbie coordinating the North Central, and that's why we have Mama Vi on this call, because you're in our North Central area, and we thank you. So we have a call every night except for Saturdays, usually at 9 o'clock Eastern time. Please take a look. Different nights do different things. From just a chit chat, tomorrow night is the Northeast with Daddy Jason and Boot Black Jess. They're hosting a discussion on sex toys from the Northeast, from Canada. And that's tomorrow night at 9 o'clock Eastern. On Wednesday night, the Mid-Atlantic got a little dirty last week, Vi. Yes, and they raised $800 for MATA, for the Mid-Atlantic Deaf Interpretation Fund.
Wow.
By Ms. Gretchen, our New Jersey title holder. It was her fundraiser. We just hosted. Cool. And the Mid-Atlantic on Wednesday night at 9 is doing a truth or dare. So if you come in the room, you consent. Okay? So if you're easily offended, don't come in the room Wednesday night. On Thursday night is Shiloh holds the Southwest Chit Chat. They're going to be telling stories of their favorite piece of leather and sharing. And I saw a whip that's going to be shared. Actually, I think that might be Honey on Friday night has a whip that you gave her that she's going to share at the opening. And then we have Judy Towing on Friday night. Telling leather stories at 9 o'clock Central. And the week always ends in the Northwest, in Oakland, San Francisco. This weekend, we're having another dance party. It's a competition. So if you want to dance around your house and take a video of yourself, we have a competition for the best dance video. The first round was won by Star and Nix. This is the second round winner, will be announced on on Sunday night. So if you have a video, send it in to womanofdrummer@gmail.com. And the dance-off the champion, hopefully, fingers crossed, will be at Ramblewood at our contest weekend. We're going to have a live dance-off between the first couple and the second winner. You can do it by yourself, or if you're shut in with someone, do the dance with them. But a crazy week ahead. And Vi, you started a great week, and we thank you so much.
Thank you all. This has been fun. I guess Toni, you know what we talked about? I guess maybe I will be doing this a tad bit more often, if only to try and make that full book make sense, and before all of the kids embarrass me with what they're about to publish.
Okay, sounds fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm going to be turning off the meeting. I hope to see you tomorrow night to talk about sex toys in the Northeast at 9 p.m. You can always find our Zoom address in the event. Thank you all for coming, all 96 of you. Good night.